Hey guys, welcome back to our channel. We are Timo and Sandra, aka Manassi, and today we're talking to you all nice and dressed up from our comfy couch in Melbourne, Australia.
We moved here around 7 months ago, and one conversation that we have constantly is how life in Europe really is versus the expectations they had, and we thought we might share this with you today in this video.
A lot of people are surprised that we actually decided to move away from Europe and move here, so we thought we'd share our thoughts in this video today.
And hopefully you find it helpful to make a decision if you want to move to Europe or not.
So one of the biggest things that I realized talking to people when they tell me how they imagine their lives being in Europe, it's kind of like they only looking at the highlights on an Instagram account of these people having the best time having holidays in Europe. When you go on a holiday and you only spend a few days in a place, can be great, a lot of fun, especially if the weather is nice, and you might think, oh, this place is awesome. But actually that's not the reality of living in a city or in a country full time. So although it is great to look at Instagram accounts and videos about places and getting an idea of how these places look like, just bear in mind that this doesn't reflect the day-to-day life. Even for us, traveling full time in a van through Europe for 2 years, we filmed a lot of beautiful spots and we really enjoyed the highlights of that trip. We also know that when we stayed in a place a little bit longer, very quickly we realized that when you live somewhere, you're not all the time on a boat, tanning under the sun, or going to amazing restaurants and museums all the time.
And in this video we really want to cover how day-to-day life is in Europe, because we both from Europe. Sandra's from Madrid, I'm from Berlin, and we experienced Europe from very different parts. For me more from the northern side and for Sandra more on the southern side of Europe. And we want to give you an overall picture.
Because even within Europe, actually, we always have this conversation at home. The way the Spanish people look at Germany and what they think life in Germany is versus actually me living there was so different.
Let's start with the first aspect, money. Life in Europe isn't cheap because rent is quite expensive. Since we are both from main cities in Europe, we really got the feel on how rent can be, and also from friends and family how much an average rent costs, and let me tell you, it's quite a bit. Rent in general in the major cities, I mean it's everywhere in the world, but especially also in Europe, because everything is so small and condensed, it's very hard to find a place sometimes, and it's also not cheap. So that's something to keep in mind, because when I talk to people here in Australia about how much average rent costs in Europe, they were quite surprised. But also you pay a lot of taxes, so there are a lot of things where you have to spend quite a bit of money on. Just keep that in mind if you consider to move to Europe, and also make sure to look specifically into the country that you want to move to, because there are quite some differences. For example, the northern parts of Europe are a bit more expensive maybe than the southern parts of Europe. Also the salary is accordingly, but we come to that in a later point. Just make sure that you have an idea what the cost of living would be in the country you want to move to.
Another thing that always comes up in conversation is that Europe has so many countries so close to each other and is so easy to travel. And yes, that is true. But actually, although it is easy to travel because everything is close to each other, it is also pretty expensive. Trains are very expensive. And flights, yes, you can get a nice offer here and there, but especially if you're thinking of traveling in summer or in a high season, the flights can also be pretty damn expensive, and let alone accommodation, going out for dinners and things like that. It all adds up, and traveling around, although it seems really fun and something that you could potentially do, at the end of the day, it's not something that happens all the time. When you live in somewhere and you have to work, cover your rent, your groceries and everything else, you don't have a lot of money or time left to be traveling around all the time. So again, if you go on a holiday, maybe that's something that you do and it's great, but when you live there, does it happen all the time? Not really.
Especially when you have to look for accommodation for these days, most of the times you can use Airbnb or hotels. I think our generation is more drawn to Airbnb. It's not so cheap. Got married in Copenhagen and we actually had to get accommodation there, and the prices there were ridiculous. I can't remember, was it like over 200?
Almost 2,000 euros for a week.
For a week.
5 days, not even 6.
Yeah, 5-6 days, and that was like medium low, a small apartment, you know, and that's just something that adds up over time. If you want to do a weekend trip all the time, sure you can do it, but especially if you want to have a nice accommodation, it can add up very quickly in these big cities.
Especially if you travel, you want to explore, you want to get out, you want to see things, you want to experience, and it all costs money.
So when I talked to people here in Australia, they were very surprised when I told them that English is maybe not as widely spoken in Europe as you might think. Depending on which area you are in Europe, especially if you're traveling to southern European countries, it can get quite difficult to communicate. For example, in Spain, Italy or France, they're either not able to speak English or they don't want to. Sorry, France. Not everywhere, but this is our overall experience after traveling these countries. Actually also Portugal. Sometimes it was also a bit hard to communicate. If you want to set up your own business, you have to speak the local language. This might be a very obvious point that you have to master the language in order to integrate fully into the country. But even setting up a business, doing things that require some official work will most likely not be in English. So you have to find a way to manage that. We met some people who set up a business in Portugal and they had great trouble to communicate with the officials. Same applies for Germany, especially. It's a bit of a difference in Scandinavia. The more northern you go, the more likely it might be that they speak better English there. Especially in Sweden, we saw on the website everything was also laid out in English and you could do some official stuff in English, which is really helpful if you want to move there and you don't speak Swedish yet. So well done, Scandinavia.
For example, when I moved from Australia to Berlin, I could not speak a word in German, and I was told it would be fine because everybody speaks English in Berlin. And the truth is that although some people do, and especially some areas where maybe more international people move to and live, you might survive without speaking German. The reality was that running a company over there was hell on earth, and for the first year before I met Timon, I had to go to cafes and pass the phone to the baristas and be like, can you please tell me what they're saying? Because official stuff, they would not speak English to me, and basic stuff like supermarkets and things like they just didn't want to do it. So it was just really challenging, and I was thinking that I'll be so fine, like everybody speaks English, and the reality is very different. Also, I remember some of our Aussie friends when they lived in Spain before they were able to speak proper Spanish. They also had a really, really hard time, because I can only say from Spanish people, because I know they're just really shy and they have their pride and they rather not talk to you than make a mistake. So that sometimes just keeps them from even trying. Even with you sometimes when we were in Spain together, they just like, no. And then when I actually tried, it was not even that bad. So just keep in mind that if you want to live somewhere in Europe and you really want to get integrated in society, you might need to consider learning the native language.
And also maybe you can talk a little bit about the social life, like what kind of bubble you were in.
Yes, definitely. When you move somewhere in Europe, reality is that if you really want to integrate yourself with the locals and the communities that live in the cities, if you don't speak the language, that can get a bit tricky. What I realized moving to Germany was that it was really hard to break into German groups. So a lot of the expats just kind of have their own bubble where they all hang out together, and there might be one German or two, but most of the times it is rare that they mix a lot. And the only way that I found, if you have a local friend that maybe integrates you into the groups, and then people warm up to you, and then you're in. But other than that, for me, the first years, I think I only socialized with other Australians or American people, just because in general I feel like Europeans are really private and maybe a bit introvert, and so they're a bit picky with who they let into their groups. Maybe if you're thinking of moving somewhere and you don't know anybody there, it could be a bit challenging. So maybe befriending one local would open some doors for you.
Or maybe bribe this local person.
Maybe
be
married.
Friends with you or married. One thing that we observed after traveling for 2 years in our van through Europe is that Europe has the trend to get more and more carless. For example, in Berlin, there are more and more streets that have bigger bicycle roads and the street gets more narrow for the cars. In Madrid, there are certain zones where you can't even enter anymore with the car. And also, for example, if you drive into Paris, theoretically you need some kind of device that allows you to, or sticker, to even enter the city. So Europe is very conscious about the traffic. or at least they try to, and it's not uncommon to not have a car and go around in publics, which is cool, it's kind of nice, but also that means that there are always a lot of people in the public transports, which can get quite annoying if you have to get pushed into it so the doors can close, you know. The good thing is you can do something for your health, get a bicycle and bike around. It's a great way to explore the cities in Europe as well. Enjoy the green zones, how they call them, and be in an environment without cars.
There's actually some cities in Europe that are much better designed for bikes than cars.
Yeah,
like
they are.
Amsterdam, Copenhagen,
Totally.
even Stockholm. The lanes for the bikes are awesome. So yeah, sometimes it's actually better to have a bike.
For sure. And I remember when we drove in Copenhagen on the bike, there's
good.
so many people and they have all these. It's also funny to observe the different hand signs they have. Like in Copenhagen, they would do like this when they turn. And in, I don't know, in Germany, people just stick out their whole arm maybe. Depending on where you are, it's quite interesting to see how people behave differently on a bike.
Another huge point that always comes up in our conversations is about accommodation or living. If you live in Australia, America, or maybe some other parts of the world, you might be used to living in a house. A full-on house with your garden, several rooms, several bathrooms. The reality in Europe is a bit different, especially if you live in cities. We both have lived only in apartments our whole lives, and that's so normal, so common. In Europe, there's not enough space for everybody to have a house with a garden, so we all live in big buildings of apartments. Rent, as we said before, is really expensive, so you might be paying probably more than you would pay for a big house somewhere else to live in a maybe one-bedroom apartment. And what's even worse is that in big cities, people have to share houses. I've done this.
I've actually never done it. Always lived on my own. Yeah.
Well, but you lived in a studio apartment, which is like fair
small,
enough. Yeah. But it's very normal that people can't afford to live by themselves. So you end up sharing an apartment. Like I used to live in a house in Berlin where one of us was renting the living room as a bedroom and the other one the other bedroom, and that was it, and we paid, as it turns out, a lot of money.
Too much.
But you just don't know if you're moving somewhere new, and especially if the market is so competitive, you just grab whatever comes to you and you don't think twice. But that's the thing to keep in mind. Space is limited, rent is expensive, and you might be forced to share an apartment with one or several people, which, you know, it's not for everybody.
And of course there are also houses, you find them a bit more outside of the cities, but it's not as common. For example, here in Australia we see all these houses in the suburbs, which is pretty normal also for share houses. It's just a bit of a different living situation here. Let's return to the big topic, money, money, money.
Must be funny.
Not so funny sometimes. So we're talking about salaries now in Europe, and also same as with maybe cultural, language differences, you also have a huge difference in salaries. The average salary in each country can differ quite a lot. For example, the salaries in the southern part of Europe tend to be a bit lower than the ones towards the northern side of Europe. Also, Eastern Europe tends to have lower salaries. So just make sure that you're aware of the average salary to the country you want to move to, because the salaries in Europe are very different. And I know that there's a big trend of people moving to Eastern Europe because the cost of living is quite low. Accordingly, also the salary is quite low. But if you have an overseas income, for example, if you work for an American company, Australian, UK, Canada, whatever, you will most likely have a decent income, but you live in a place where the cost of living is very low. But you just have to make sure that if you are depending on a local company, that the salary can be much lower than you might have expected.
Just as an example for you, when I was maybe 17 or 18 and I was working as a barista in a specialty coffee shop in Spain, I was earning, I think, if I remember correctly, around €6 an hour. And I moved to Australia doing the same job, actually probably less hours, and I was getting paid $25 an hour, which is probably 19 to 20 euros an hour.
We put the euro here.
Which is like more than double, just for the same thing. So yeah, it was just pretty shocking to see the differences in the salary. So if you're thinking of moving somewhere, just do some Googling, do some research, and make sure that you're gonna be earning accordingly to your lifestyle. Another big point for us that actually made us want to move to Australia, but it's a big point wherever you are and you're thinking of moving to, is your social life, making new friends. Europeans tend to be a bit more introvert, and it's not so easy to connect with people as you would do in other places in the world, like America or Australia, where you can just talk to strangers and somehow you make friends everywhere. I think Europeans are not so used to that, maybe because of the culture. So it can be a bit hard if you're new in a country in Europe to interact with the local people. So as we said before, it is always a good idea to meet one local, and that could open doors to other locals, maybe integrating in some aspect of the country or the city that you're living in a bit better than if you just hang out with other internationals, because I feel like you just experience the place so different.
And this might be an international phenomenon not only in Europe, but the thing is that especially where we come from in these countries, Spain and Germany, people tend to have a social life around the things they grew up with. So for example, they have friends from school or from hobbies, from activities, and these groups are really tied together, and it's a bit hard to get into these groups, and it's maybe not as open, or they're not so inviting in general, especially if you're maybe an international. And of course there are exceptions where people are very warm and let you in, but I feel like it is not so easy sometimes to get into a community and a crowd of people that have been together already over decades. And I could imagine that this is probably a similar principle everywhere in the world, but we just experienced, for example, moving here to Australia, that it is really easy to start up a conversation even with a stranger and make connections much easier than, for example, in Europe, at least in our view. So let's talk about the holiday season in Europe. Most of the times during the summer holidays, kids have summer holidays. And if you have kids, you take your holidays at the same time, so you can travel and do things. Have a nice holiday, you know?
Which is normally July and August.
Exactly. And the thing is that a lot of people come to Europe in these months, and then you have international people coming to Europe to have their holidays, but you also have Europeans that are on holidays, and it can get really, really crowded and actually also really expensive because there's such a high demand. So if you're planning your holidays, that's maybe something to keep in mind, that the summer months are always the busiest. Maybe an obvious point, but this also means that even if you live in Europe, you have to face the same problem, that it's very crowded and it's maybe not so easy to find little spots where there are not so many people around.
For example, we've learned that here they have holidays every end of a term in school. Every, 3 or 4 months, they have 1-2 weeks of holidays, and then they travel around. So it's not so concentrated like maybe it is in Europe. I've also heard though many times that Americans only have like a week or 2 weeks of holidays a year. So in that case, Europe, I feel like it's a bit better. You tend to have a bit longer holidays.
Yeah, that's the positive side, that there's a good maybe work-life balance in terms of you have quite a lot of holiday days, also depending on your job. But in general, there is a great understanding on having downtime and holidays, and that you are not working when you're on holidays. That's just normal. Maybe that's a bit different in other countries where the work ethic is very high, maybe a little too high, and you can never switch off. So that's something that is very common and very accepted in Europe, that when you're on holidays and you're not expected to work or do anything except enjoying yourself.
Something to keep in mind about Europe is that it's still pretty old school. Things in most countries are, well, let's say, not so easy, or they take a long time. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved in every single thing that you need to do in your life. Especially, I would say, in the Southern European countries, they're still pretty old school in the sense of how they work. It's still pretty much, you have to call, you have to send letters, you have to do this and that.
But physical letters, we're talking about an envelope with paper in it, which is pretty normal to send around all the time.
Especially in Germany.
Yeah.
I think that maybe in the Northern European countries, like in Sweden and stuff, they're very modern and everything is fast and on your phone and things like this. In a lot of places like Portugal, Italy, Spain, France, they're still pretty old school. They take their time, everything is slow. There's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through to get to one paper that you need, blah, blah, blah. And keep in mind that it might be challenging to get that paper, to solve that problem. Just be patient. And especially if you don't speak the language and you have to go through all of that process in a second language, that could be a lot.
One thing that people seem very excited about when I talk with them about Europe is the food culture. There are a lot of different cultures in Europe in very close proximity. So there are a lot of traditional cuisines, for example, paella in Spain, or I don't know, I already run out of things right now because I just was thinking
Schnitzel.
Schnitzel, yeah, maybe Schnitzel, German traditional food. I'm not a big fan of it, but there is a traditional kitchen as well.
But when you think of countries in Europe, like there's certain things that come to mind, you know, like people go to Italy for the pasta and pizza,
Yes.
to France for the wine and cheese, to Spain for the seafood and the paella.
Yes,
So
yes.
there's always like very different and rich cuisines and food.
So most countries have their own tradition when it comes to food, and food is celebrated. It's very common to sit down and have dinner together with your family, especially in Spain for dinner, late dinners, maybe at 10, 11 p.m. And then you sit and you have a feast. And of course, if you want to experience this food culture, you want to go out to restaurants. Well, this is where things can go wrong in terms of customer service. And that's just something that you have to keep in mind when you move to Europe. Customer service in general is not a thing. Like, there are exceptions where you have a lovely person that is willing to help you, but in general, customer service is just horrible. And I think that's just so different when you maybe look over to America, where people maybe have to be nice to get a tip. Here in Australia, I think there's not a tipping culture, but there's just an amazing customer service where people, if you enter a store or if you need help, they're really willing to help you. So just be aware that if you face a problem, that sometimes customer service will not be a thing and will not help you to solve your problem, and then you have to be self-reliant, hands-on, and find a solution.
So if you're thinking of moving somewhere in Europe and this is something that you think you want to do, maybe a good idea is to, if you can, spend a month or two in this place and get a feel of how it is to be there every day, getting a bit more submerged in the culture before you make a big final decision. But if this is something you really feel called to, by all means, go ahead, live your dream, because at the end, you never know until you try. So we made it to the end of the video. We want to make very clear that this is our experience and our opinion on living in Europe. We've traveled a lot, both together and separately with our families and for work and all of these things, and we've definitely gathered a lot of information that we wanted to share with you all today. We hope that you find this video helpful.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and thank you so much for watching, guys. Subscribe, of course, and we see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.
Hi guys, welcome back to our channel. We are Timo, Sandra.
We are Sandra and Timo.